have one. Hopefully I'll figure it out before next Tuesday. Before next Thursday. So we'll figure it out. It's 10:28, so we're going to give everybody a couple minutes to join us, okay? Hi everybody, it's 10:30, welcome. It'll be helpful for me if you sit in your usual seats, so Stan and Roz sit in front over here, and Josh sit all the way in the back, and Bruce and Barbara over here, and Bob Wolf all the way in the back row where you usually sit. Dave and Ruth Ann and Sarah Jane can all sit over by the coffee. I'll let you know if I need a refill, but I'm drinking herbal tea this morning. I'm not really drinking any coffee. Can you hear Rena laughing at me in the background since I'm talking to myself, but really talking to all of you? So the first thing I want to tell you is, what, Reen? Everybody's up and learning. Is that we're on live streaming, but I really want you to participate. So if you would please, I'm opening up my phone and my email. As you have questions or comments as we're going along, email me. If we figure out a better way to do it, I'm happy to do that. But for now, why don't we use email? And I think you know, but in case you need to know, my email is dwechsler, DWECHSLER, @chizukamuno.org. So if you'll email me, let me know you're with us, let me know you have a question or you want to discuss something or a comment, and I'm happy to answer them live on the air, if you will. When we met 2 weeks ago, hold on one second, I'm having some background noise in my house. Sorry about that. The challenge of teaching and honey, no, I'm not kidding. Just deal.
This is the whole house.
I know it's the whole. Do we need to do this in front of the whole? Hi guys, sorry about that. Now you really get to see my real life and what it's like at home right now. When we met 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the 5 principles. Our class on life cycle right now is focusing on death and dying. We've actually already gotten up to the death part. And some of you I know are new. Some of you have been with us for a long time. Excuse me just for one moment. Hi, everybody. So we sort of pivoted in our class, and we're looking at death and dying, but the way I wanted to organize it for you was to look at 5 principles that govern really all of the mitzvot associated with death and dying. So those of us who have been learning for a little while together on this subject, we've already looked at the first 3. I'm going to move my notes in front of me. So the first 3 are sacred sorrow is number 1. Number 2 is recognition of the reality of death. You can think of the kinds of mitzvot like not having an open casket, not putting makeup on the face of someone who's died, not using flowers to cover up the smell because that denies the reality of death, if you will. And then the third one that we talked about was respect for the dead, meaning respect for the body itself. That Judaism believes that the body is sacred, and the body is sacred not because it's so fantastic, but because it's the vessel for the soul. So for as long as the body is the home of the soul, the body itself is sacred. And then, even at the moment of death, when we understand the soul as leaving the body maintains some of its status as sacred because the reality is that there is still something of the sacred that remains with the body after that time. So that's what we've done together so far. Those of you who are catching up, any questions about the first 3 of the 5 principles that we already covered? Or I know my parents are on with us. They're welcome to email with parenting advice as they watch me do it in real time, better and less better, as the case may be. If when you see me looking, it's because I'm turning to my phone to check for questions. If not, then we're gonna move on. So the way I would start today is connected to our subject, but I would say that it's also very much connected to the time in which we are living. The 4th principle that governs the Jewish approaches to death and mourning is equality in death. We Jews firmly believe that we are created, and I actually don't mean Jews, that human beings are created, B'Tselem Elohim, that every human life is created in the image of God. And that has an important meaning for us, both today in the moment in which we're living, and really every day. Being created b'tselem Elohim means that every human being is of equal dignity and equal value. There have certainly been times, we have to be honest with ourselves about who the Jewish people are and have been throughout history. And there have certainly been times when I think the Jewish people would not say that all human beings were of equal dignity and value, but really just saw the Jewish community and Jews as of equal dignity and value. But as you read shortly before all of this started, that's something that we've been addressing within the congregation, is our embrace of all Jews and of all human beings and treating them as equals. Anyone want to make a comment or a question about this notion of Tselem Elohim and what the conversation that we raised with all of you, that Rabbi Gruenberg and I raised with all of you? It was probably the week before all of this started with the coronavirus, about the incident in Shul with African American visitors, Jews of color, who had experienced some latent and not so latent racist comments at the congregation. The part that was so difficult, if you'll please email me so we can share some thoughts and some questions. It was something that was very difficult to see and to experience. We all grew up with with relatives who had certain ideas, who used certain kinds of language with which we were more or less comfortable. But to put it into a Jewish framework, it was a way that the Jewish community used to see people as being as less than Tselem Elohim, being of less dignity and less value. We often say it that it's Tselem Elohim in the sense of the spirit, in the sense of not of the body, because we don't know what God's body looks like, but in the sense of the soul. That's the traditional notion. But for those of us who grew up in very Jewish communities that all looked a certain way, our understanding and our vision of Tselem Elohim can perhaps be limited. I know I'm taking us a little bit afar from our focus on death and dying, but this fourth principle of equality in death and the mitzvot very much, sorry, my phone keeps going off, very much has to do with this concept of equality. So let's start a bit of a discussion. Can you think of an example of a mitzvah relating to death and dying that would be included in this principle of equality in death? I'm going to give you a minute to write in. What are ways in our own practices that show how we treat people equally? I'm seeing emailed comments is maybe not going to be the way to go. I'm missing that immediate back and forth that we have in a class. We'll work on it. for now. Or maybe you'll listen a little bit and then some other things will occur to you. So some of the things that are occurring to me when we talk about equality. So Joanne Kraus just wrote in. She said dressing in shrouds. So there's a tradition, let's call it, a halacha, but certainly a tradition as well, that after we die, we're dressed not in our most favorite ball gown or our most comfortable JTS fleece, but that we are dressed in linen shrouds. The shrouds have a couple of interesting features. And I think one or two of you told me in class 2 weeks ago that you participated in a Chevra Kadisha. If you did, I'd love it if you would jump in, because it's been a long time since I've been a part of a Chevra Kadisha. But one of the features of the shrouds, it has no pockets, because guess what, everybody? You can't take it with you. So there is that sense of simplicity. You can't fill your pockets with gold and pay for your path across the river Styx. I'm mixing my Jewish and my Greek mythology right now, but you understand what I'm saying. The shrouds are there so that the poorest person doesn't have to wear rags, and the richest person does not get to wear, I don't know, couture, the fanciest clothing they can possibly find. The nature of the shroud is that it's a simple garment that's sewn on to someone. A pop culture reference, if any of you watch Grey's Anatomy on Thursday night, I don't even know how long ago it was. We save up the episodes and we watch them. But there was an episode in which a Jewish doctor's uncle died, and the man's partner came to do the tahara, which we'll talk about, and he, at the end, dressed him in shrouds. Now, it's not exactly what they look like. On the show, they sort of wrapped him up in a sheet. But white is on the money, and to the degree that we could tell, simple with no adornment on it. It's not just a matter of rich and poor. The rabbis were also concerned that those who were at the very upper strata of society, even the rabbis themselves, the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, didn't want there to be any distinction or special privileges that were offered in death to those who were of greater means, or who were more important, if you will. Those of you who still have the stomach to read the news, I try to only read a little bit of it nowadays. I find it helps to tamp down my stress and anxiety. I leave that to my children. But I'm able to tamp down my anxiety by not reading too much of the news. But I do usually read the New York Times every day, and there was an article last night about why so many prominent people, athletes, celebrities, people in the arts, seem to be able to get tested, and, quote, ordinary people are not able to get tested for coronavirus. It was something that occurred to me as I was preparing class. So Joanne mentioned shrouds. Fran Glushiko mentioned that we bury in a plain pine casket. If you've ever been to Levinson's, you've seen that there are a couple different versions of their plain pine casket. And most people do like the simplicity. It is the same. We use a plain pine casket for the same reason that we use shrouds. There's no need for a titanium casket to have the fanciest casket in the ground or in the cemetery, or something better to knock on. Save titanium for your wedding ring, Or someone gave me recently for my 50th birthday a titanium cake plate, which seems like a fantastic idea considering how many things fall on the floor in our house. But a plain pine casket, sometimes it has handles on the side, sometimes it doesn't have handles on the side, sometimes it has slightly more adorned corners. It is a final message, not only about the deceased, but perhaps even more importantly, to those present, that we are all the same in the eyes of God. Quite literally, if you want to picture the divine looking down from the heaven, either in the moments that someone lies in a casket, or if they are, if God is looking from above at the cemetery, what God sees is the uniformity. What we have to present, we say, is just our mitzvot. You've probably heard me teach that in the context of another mitzvah. I learned it from one of my teachers, Rabbi Marshall Meyer, who was responsible. He was the rabbi at B'nai Jeshurun before his death. He was responsible for its reinvigoration when he himself moved back from South America and started the synagogue. You've heard me joke about bikini taluses that kind of hang around your neck and are like a bikini. They only cover the absolute necessity, and they sort of cover the same things that a bikini covers. But he used to say that that's part of the reason that we wear a large-sized talit, not just that the halacha says a talus should be enough to cover a child of about 4 years old. No bikini talus would be able to cover a 4-year-old. But because if you imagine the view from above, let's say, the talitot cover up our clothing. It doesn't matter how fancy or how not fancy our clothing is and how we come before God. The only thing that God notices are the corners of the tzitziot, the corners of the talit. God sees our mitzvot, not our bank account, which is probably good given the way the market is going nowadays. Helen also wrote in to say a simple wooden coffin. Helen, I'm so glad you're here. I hope you're feeling better today. I know you had a cold. I'm reading comments from and questions. Margie Simon also mentioned about a casket. Miriam Har added something important. She said that both men and women are buried in shrouds. We haven't really talked about, and to be honest, really, Miriam, until I read your comment, I don't know that I thought so much about the equality of men and women in death. I have gotten the question a number of times over the years whether women should be buried in talitot. You may know that there's a custom that if someone was a talus wearer during their life, that they're buried in their talit after death, but we do not bury a whole kosher talus with a person. We snip one of the tzitziot. We do that so that it's not a halachic, it's not a kosher talus, if you will. The Shulchan Aruch has this really colorful explanation for talitot in cemeteries. The phrase is called lo'eg larash, that it's mocking or it's making fun. To bury someone with a kosher talit is sort of the Shulchan Aruch sees it as a final insult to someone, that they're wearing the talit, they're wearing the symbol of the mitzvot, right? You've heard me explain it lots of times that the reason the talit symbolizes all of the mitzvot is because of the tzitzit. The word tzitzit, if you add up the gematria, the numerical equivalent of each of the letters, the word tzitzit equals 600, And then on each corner, I'm holding it up like I have it, but I already folded up my tallis this morning and put it away. It's right here. I can grab it. Like my tallis bag. So here's a tzitzit. So the word tzitzit, we say, equals 600. On each corner, there are 8 little strands, so 608. And then also on each corner, there are 5 sets of knots. So 6 plus 13, 613. By the way, that's the easiest math that's getting done in my house today. We already had tears over 8th grade math homework. But luckily, we have lots of online resources for that. So the talit represents all of the mitzvot, and because it represents all of the mitzvot, that's the way we present ourselves to the world. I'm pretty comfortable with that, to be perfectly honest, in a world that's so concerned with outward appearances. To know that the Jewish value is not on outward appearances, but it's on how we present ourselves mitzvot-wise. So Miriam had said that there's equality in death for men and women and that they're both worn in shrouds. Miriam, I don't know if you meant, Miriam Har, I don't know if you meant specifically for men and women, or you were sort of generalizing when you were saying that everyone was buried in shrouds. We don't bury men in shrouds and women in ball gowns. But as I mentioned, women also are buried in talitot. If you're not buried in a talit, or someone in your family was not buried in a talit, I don't want you to go panic now. All right? It's not required. It's a tradition. It's a custom. There are lots of families that choose not to bury in a talit because it's such a precious family heirloom. Rena was able to wear a talit from Jay's father for part of her bat mitzvah, and then part of it she wore the talit that my mom made for her. And then there are other families that when my grandfather died, my mother took the atara off of my grandfather's talit. So he was buried in the talit that he wore, and saved the atara for, I think the oldest grandson got it, is what happened. But I'm sure my family will remind me after this class of what happened to my grandfather's atara. Women who wear talitot now, the same applies. When you bring a loved one's things to Levinson, you can drop off a talit, and if you're not able to find their talit in enough time to be able to drop it off before the funeral, there's no harm done. So that's perfectly acceptable. There was somebody else who made a comment. Oh, so Fran. Hi, Fran. I hope Lauren's feeling well. Fran sent in a question. She said, the concept of, is my blood redder than his? Can you clarify the reference? While you're clarifying that, Fran, I'll address the second part, or I will try to answer the second part of your question. Fran said, how do you decide in this climate who gets medical help? It's a really good question based on the concept of Tselem Elohim. If you believe every life is of equal dignity and value, then how do you decide who gets the ventilator? So the first thing I want to say is I've been really gratified to see how many of you are staying home. When we were on Zoom Monday night, I think it was Monday night, and what I've been hearing from you, almost all of you are staying home, which I'm glad you're doing. I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad that it's helping to keep everybody else safe. I'm home too. I wave at people from my door. My postman stopped by yesterday to tell me he was retiring. I think he probably wanted a tip. But I told him I was quarantined and he'd have to wait till after Friday for his tip. So that's the first thing I want to say in response, Fran. is that, as I wrote to you in one of the letters, I really believe it is a moral and religious obligation to stay home right now as much as possible. Obviously, if you need medications or you need food, one goes out to do that, and then one comes home. And that is doing our part so that we won't have to make this decision that Fran is asking about how we decide who gets medical help. Fran, I am happy that I don't have to make that decision. And I don't envy my friends who are physicians, who are running hospitals. My father just sent me an email. I'll tell you about it later. I don't envy the decisions of those who are running hospitals, of those who are physicians. And I pray to God that by staying home and staying away from each other, that we are able to prevent and to help out our medical system from having to make the kind of choices that we've been making. Can you hold on 1 second? Rena, are you good?
Yeah, I finished my meeting.
All right, great. Thank you. My father emailed me to say that my nephew Henry, number 2 nephew, got the atara because number 1 nephew Ben does not wear a talit because they sort of identify ortho in the shul they go to. Men don't wear talit tot until they're married, and he's only 17. Maybe he's 16. No, I think he's 17. And so thankfully he's not married yet at 17. So no talis for Benjamin. So Fran wrote back to me, and Fran wrote back to me about the text. She said, I don't remember where I heard that text, but I'm thinking about it in terms of self-defense. Who gets limited amounts of food? God, I hope that's not where we're heading. That's not where we're heading, Fran. We've seen a little bit of a shift in society. I think so. Things are changing so quickly. So I hope it's true. For example, I saw online that the Giant was having what someone affectionately called Altacocker hours, but that the Giant was having special hours from 6 to 9 in the morning for people over 60 to do their shopping. And I saw that Fresh Market was doing the same, maybe from 8 to 9. I'm not sure. It's not a place I usually shop. But I think that that's a really beautiful way that society is choosing in a positive sense to take care of those so that we don't have to make the kinds of choices that you're saying. Fran, when you talk about limited food supplies, there's also been, I know I'm touching my face, you guys. I'm very self-conscious about it when I'm looking at the live stream. But I promise I'll wash after class, so I'm going to stop obsessing about it. When you talk about limited food, there has been, for about the past week or so, when there's been this crazy rush and this terrible fear of food shortages, which I know some of you remember from the war. I'm 50. I don't have a memory of that. You know, the only food shortages I remember are Barton's almond kisses. And I managed quite well, thank you, for the years when they weren't available. But when talking about food shortages in the past week, I can give you a couple of examples that we've seen in society now. One is something that my folks told me about and you may have read about in Rochelle. You know that they're in the containment zone. But on their walks outside, when their mean children allow them to go outside, they see the National Guard in front of the schools being able to hand out food to kids who otherwise would have gotten meals at school and are not able to get meals now. They also told me, sadly, that a lot of people wouldn't even come out, that people in New Rochelle were too afraid to come out of their homes to even get the food that was being provided for them I understand Baltimore County is doing a better job of that. I think being at many different schools and delivering if necessary, so that families who normally get food through school are still getting food even now that school is closed. So that's one example. I appreciate those who anticipated the unforeseen challenges and complications and making sure that students are fed even when they're learning virtually. And the second is the concern for WIC, which you may know about, Women's, Infants, and Children, which is a federal program that provides food products for those who need. Only certain products are WIC eligible. For example, you can't buy soda with WIC and certain kinds of cereals and other things. And there's been a real effort at the supermarkets and elsewhere for people who don't need federal assistance to buy products that don't have a WIC designation, so those can be saved for the people who really need the food. Fran, I can tell you what I read and what I know. Some of you I know spend a lot more time online and a lot more time with the newspapers these days. You've made your own choice about that, or maybe it doesn't make you as anxious as it makes me. But our leaders tell us that there are no food shortages, and that there are no paper or toilet paper shortages, that there are pallets of supplies that are available and that are coming to us. So I don't know, maybe you think my answer is a cop-out, but thank God right now that is not something that we have to deal with, because we don't have to make those choices. The last time I remember speaking about it, it was actually a challenge from Rabbi Zaman. Do you remember? I don't even remember how many years. Jody, you're probably there and you're probably on your phone and you can tell me in super fast time. But do you remember when the miners were trapped? The Chilean miners were trapped underground, and they finally figured out a way to bring them up. I think I had a Shabbos meal at Rabbi Zaman's house that week. Obviously, Ann cooked, not Rabbi Zaman. And he said to me, how are they going to decide who gets to come up first? Because they don't know if it's going to work, and they don't know for how long it's going to work. So it'd be very interesting to learn the criteria which they choose. That's the nearest analogy that I can find. And I remember at the time, I can access it later and check it for you later, Fran, when I can remotely access my work computer. I think it was a text from Rabbi Akiva about if you're in the desert and there's only so much water in a canteen. I think that's probably one of the Talmud's few connections. But it's an interesting thought, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to make a note on my notes, and I'm going to look it up for next week to see how we decide that somebody should have which resources. When it came to the miners, I think that they ended up bringing the strongest guy up first, because they didn't know if it would break halfway and he was going to have to essentially rescue himself if the rescue failed. And then there was an order, but that's interesting. I'll see if I can locate it. If I can locate that sermon, I wonder if it'll give us any insight into our current situation, as we really hope we're not making difficult decisions. Any other thoughts before we move on to the fifth principle about equality in death? Joanne Krause says, medical ethics principle. Joanne, until 2 weeks ago, was a social worker at Hopkins at Bayview. So I'm glad she's weighing in. Joanne says, medical ethics principle of justice is not something that can be decided at the bedside. Our obligation is to advocate to meet people's needs. But when there is not enough to go around, are there Jewish rules for rationing, and are there Jewish rules for queues? I assume you mean food queues. So Joanne, I'm gonna add that, and it's something that will I'm writing while I'm talking to you. And it's something that we'll talk about next week. Hopefully we're interested in the intellectual sense, as I told you before the Passover class, rather than the practical sense. I do want to take issue or challenge some of what you said at the beginning of your point about the medical ethics principle of justice is not something that can be decided at the bedside. What I think you mean, but I'm not sure, and so feel free to write in and correct me, is that you can't decide on a case-by-case basis, and you have to make some general decisions about principles by which you're going to operate. I think it's what a lot of us have been reading from the doctors in Italy about the choices they've had to make, and I imagine that's where your question came from, Fran, that we've read about other countries who have had to make these terrible choices as to who gets care and who doesn't get care. And I think, Joanne, you're trying to comment that it doesn't get made individually at the bedside, or do you mean that Jewishly we don't believe it gets made at the bedside? We root ourselves in Jewish values, and that's how we make the decision. That's been an interesting process over the past week as we've gone online. Rabbi Gruenberg and I have had several conversations about what's actually needed in the community, what the halacha allowed before, what it allows now, and how it is evolving literally on a daily basis. Did you see that some of the Haredi rabbis in Israel have said, leave your phone on Shabbos so you can be part of a minyan? Don't you love it? The conservative rabbis were trendsetters and inspired the ultra-Orthodox establishment to have virtual minyanim. There are conservative synagogues that are too frum to have virtual minyans. And today you have the Haredim saying that they should be convening virtual minyans, even leaving a phone on Shabbat so they can do it. We'll gloat later after class together, shall we? But the conversations that we've been having are what happens when the real practical halacha conflicts with what the actual needs of the community are. You've seen the choices that we've made this week, choices that I don't think we've made in the history of the congregation, but to the nearest that we can tell, there hasn't been such a moment in the history of the congregation. So we are operating on our best foundational Jewish principles, even though things like live streaming on Shabbat, creating a Zoom minyan for those bar mitzvah families that desire it, we are able to make, we hope, our best decisions for the moment. And it's an evolving process, and it is not an easy process, I will tell you that. It sure has been interesting, however. All right, Joanne got back to me. She said, Secular medical ethics determines justice. Secular medical ethics determines justice to be more at a policy level. Look, there's something about that appeals to me in the sense that it ties in, and that's the point at which it ties into what we're talking about equality and death and Tselem Elohim. If a decision's being made at a bedside, right? So if justice is not if secular medical ethics is deciding justice at the bedside instead of a policy level, then a Tom Hanks, who should live and be well. We love Tom Hanks. We loved Mr. Rogers' movie. But if it's being made at the bedside, you could see how, and he's out of the hospital, so this is theoretical, but you can see how a Tom Hanks might be given a ventilator before a Joe Schmo or a Chaim Yankel, an ordinary person. But that if it's decided at a policy level, then you take the Tom Hanks and the Joe Schmo identities out of it. And you look at whatever you look at. Look, I don't know the medical piece of it. You look at their lung function, you look at who's doing best on a scale of 1 to 10. However, the physicians are starting to determine that in our hospitals here in Baltimore that are starting to see corona cases. So that it's done based on who has the greatest need or who has the greatest likelihood of benefiting from it and surviving. And those decisions are best made at the policy level instead of at an individual level. So Joanne, I would say that it's not just secular, because if as Jews we believe in Tselem Elohim, then we also have to believe that there are some standards that are beyond even mitzvot, right? That's the challenge Jewishly, and you and me, we've all seen this 100 times before. You can't even judge on mitzvot when you're talking about food and when you're talking about medical resources, right? Tselem Elohim, there is infinite dignity and value to every human being. You have two people who need ICU beds. One's a Shabbos observer, or forget Shabbos. One's a super fine human being. They do so many acts of chesed, and they are loving, and they're, I don't know, a parent, a grandparent. Is it fair, is it Jewish to take those kinds of concerns into account instead of the medical concerns? And I think if we use Tselem Elohim as an operating principle, then we can't. You got somebody from death row who needs an ICU bed more than a super do-gooder parent of 10? Maybe you're gonna yell at me on email, but I think that Tselem Elohim says that everyone's created in the image of God, and you follow the best dictates that we have to honor human life. And it's a way that we live out v'chai bahem. It was how we initially made the statement when the physical synagogue was closing. That verse from Deuteronomy, although it's elsewhere in Deuteronomy too, since Deuteronomy is almost always a repeat of earlier material, that the mitzvot were given for you to live by them, not to die by them. And that is part of this human desire, or this Jewish desire to honor human life. The poor suffer enough for being poor. They don't have to suffer additionally medically. They don't have to suffer additionally after death. See, I'm bringing it back to our topic. Equality in death means that the poor don't get poorer treatment simply because they couldn't manage it. Wouldn't it be lovely? Maybe lovely is an exaggeration, but I remember in rabbinical school, we had something called senior seminar, which was sort of real life rabbinics finally for that last year before you went out into the pulpit. I wasn't planning to go into a pulpit, so I slept through most of it, but I think I'm doing okay right now. And what I do remember Rabbi Lebo saying was that he felt one of the greatest kindnesses he did for his congregation was that his congregation had an arrangement with the Jewish funeral home. I think he was in Chicago before he moved to New York, but I don't remember. And what Rabbi Lebo did was he essentially created a package for his shul so that no decisions had to be made, although if somebody wanted to change it, they certainly could. All of the decisions were made. Instead of you having to go into Levinson's and choose a casket and choose a shroud and choose what was done, the synagogue had selected the most traditional options, if you will, the plain pine casket, the plain shrouds, shmirah, these are things we've talked about, someone watching the body, without any of the extras. And it was done both to keep the cost down as a kindness for people. It was done so that people wouldn't have to make decisions when they are grieving so hard. And it was done as a way of staying true to the Jewish values, to make sure that even families that were unaware of the Jewish approaches to death and dying were still able to keep up with everything that the tradition needed to do. You could go into the funeral home in Chicago or wherever it was, Midwest someplace, I think, and just tell them you were from that synagogue, and they would know right away what to do for you. 21 years later, something that stayed with me as far as practice, and that some of you have asked me about over the years. Hold on a sec. Josh Rosen, how are you? I miss you. I heard you've been davening along at home. Your daughter's reporting back to me. Actually, a lot of you have children who are reporting back to me. You better watch out what you say and what you do. Josh says, save the young. We'll see. I don't get a vote, Josh, for better and for worse. Nobody's calling to ask me. I'm not sure what I want to say about that. Sorry, I'm reading emails. I don't know who this is because it's just a phone. I'm going to give out your cell phone number alive. Whoever's 410-205-0164, I can't download your text. I'm sorry. Everybody call them. I'm teasing. It's good that I can at least crack myself up. Joanne agrees with me. Thank God, Joanne. I was worried. I think somebody said Mr. F's. Oh, yeah, that's a really nice example. Years ago, some of you were present. Josh Rosen, you were present. Alan Cantor was present. We had more than a minion present. There was a man, I don't think he was a young man, Mr. F. You might have heard me speak about him at one time. He came into Hopkins as a John Doe, but in the course, he didn't live very long. He wasn't at Hopkins alive very long, which they knew as soon as he came in, and it became clear very quickly that he was Gosses, that he was dying immediately. It also became clear very quickly that he was Jewish, that he had Jewish parents, although I don't believe he had ever lived a Jewish life or had any connection. And the synagogue was able to do a really beautiful mitzvah that exemplified this principle of equality in death. and that is that we got together with Levinson's to provide a funeral for this John Doe knot. Had we not, he would have ended up in whatever Baltimore calls its Potter's Field. So Chizuk Amuno donated a cemetery plot. I donated my services. The monument company donated the vault that we needed for him. Levinson's donated all of their services. No one charged a thing. And Chizuk Amuno, you provided a minyan to say Kaddish and to bury him with dignity and respect. So that surprisingly took us to almost the end of class. I'm looking to see if my mysterious cell phone person wrote back. Nah, you'll get back to me during the day. Next week, the last of the 5 principles, which is consolation, meaning the way we walk with God. We're going to talk about the art of making a Shiva call. And I hope that our class is going to take on the responsibility next week of creating an article, a list of principles, a paragraph of best advice. Before this, when I had planned this lesson, I planned to talk to you about the art of making a Shiva call and how we comfort the bereaved in your own experiences when you were sitting Shiva. Obviously, now we are in unprecedented and unusual times when we can't make Shiva calls face-to-face. So I would very much like, if part of our class next Thursday, here's your homework to think about between now and then, is to come up with a set of guidelines that we can share with our entire community for how to make Shiva calls in this difficult time. Think back to the times when you had newly experienced a loss, and imagine if you had to be home by yourself the whole time, and how difficult that must have been. So we will talk about that next week. A few notes. I know a bunch of you are big readers because you know I'm a reader, so we always talk about what we're reading. The Jewish Women's Archive, you can find them online, is starting a quarantine book club. Isn't that a fantastic idea? They've already got 4 authors to commit. Tonight, Rachel Kadish, who some of you saw when she was at Chizuk 2.5 years ago, she came to speak about her book, The Weight of Ink. She happens to be super great friends with Tova Mervis, who also lives in Boston near her. And the two of them are doing the very first book chat tonight. I think it's at 8 p.m. But if you go online and look up Jewish Women's Archive, you'll see their book chat and then 2 more for the next 2 weeks. The other thing I wanted to mention, because the Wednesday email was so long, I'm afraid you might have missed it. We asked Rabbi Ben Shalva if he would do a special quarantine Shir Shabbat. Of course, we can't get the band together, and you're going to miss my beautiful voice. But Rabbi Shalva is going to be streaming. He lives just around the corner from Rabbi Gruenberg. So I asked him if he would walk over to Rabbi Gruenberg's house tomorrow night, and we're going to do a little Shir Shabbat together for our Friday night services at 6 p.m. So by all means, spread the word. I hope you have a really good day, everybody. I'm so happy to hear from you when you're at services and to hear from you on Facebook. So please continue to be in touch. I'm going to continue the Passover class that I started this past Monday. I actually have a conflict. If you can believe it, I still have conflicts in my schedule for next Monday night at 7:30. So I'm going to figure out how to move it for next week so I can attend a meeting at 7 that I need to. But we'll be in touch via email and all of that. I also thought maybe we'd do a Chizuk Amuno challah bake. You want to bake challah with me at home? I'm not sure I have the supplies for tomorrow because, as I mentioned, I'm quarantined until tomorrow night. But I will, if you're interested, let me know. And if you think that sounds fun to do a Chizuk challah bake virtually, and I'll send you out a recipe list, and we'll do it. If not tomorrow, if I don't have the stuff, then next week. But not too much challah because Pesach is coming. Have a great day, everybody.